Hi, and welcome to a brand new video. So today we're going to be tackling the problem on the screen. We're given an m by n integer matrix, and if the element is 0, then we need to set its entire row and columns to 0. So essentially, it's kind of like paintball. So if you have the 0 in the center here, you make the entire row 0 and you make the entire column, as you can see in this example here. So what we're going to do is we're going to first iterate through the matrix, and if there is a 0, then we're going to only set the first element in the row or column 0. And that will be kind of like a flag indicator. So if there is a 0 there, then we'll know to set the row and column to 0 later. The reason we don't set it directly is because if we make it 0, then in the next iteration they might accidentally think that that was part of the original matrix, and that's obviously not what we want. So that's why we're just going to set the first one and then we'll iterate through it later. There's one problem with this though. So if we have something like 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. So if we set the first element in the row here, that would be here, but this is also the first element. So therefore, both this column and this row sets this to be 0. And we don't want that, right? Because if we set it to be the row, then we don't know the column and vice versa. Because if it's like this, we don't want to set both of them, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to just use an additional variable for the first column. Other than that, we'll be using like this row and this column for the indicators. So first step is to create a variable, and this is just going to be for the first call, and this is going to be set as false initially. Then we can iterate through the matrix. So just do a simple for loop, and the goal here is that we see that if matrix I of j is equal to 0, just set matrix of I of 0 to 0 and matrix of j of 0 to 0. Oh, whoops. It's actually 0, 0 of j. Perfect. So last thing we need to do in this for loop is say that if matrix of I of 0, so this is saying that if an element inside the first row is equal to 0, then set that first call to true. And then if you want to obviously save a little bit more time, which you probably want to do in programming questions, then you can set j equals to 1 because technically we just handle it right over here if j is 0. So this step is going to be setting the flags with 0. The next step is to actually iterate through and set the respective rows and columns. So set the respective rows and columns to 0. So in order to do that, we're first going to iterate through, and we're going to be starting with 1. I'm messing up all the time here today, but we're going to be starting here with 1 because for I equals 0, that is the first row, right? So those have our flags in it, and we don't want to mess up our flags for now. So let's iterate through the rest of it before we deal with our flags. So that's what we're just going to be starting at 0 right over here. And we need to say that if matrix of I of 0 equals to 0 or matrix of 0 of j equals to 0. So basically saying that if there's a flag at the beginning, then we need to set matrix of I of j to 0 as well. So what this is doing is that for the rows without the flags in them, we'll be able to set matrix of i's. We'll be able to set the respective rows and columns to 0. And here's the thing for the rest of the matrix. Since the flag is 0, we technically don't have to remake those flags 0. But we do have to deal with that first cell. We need to deal with cell 0 of 0 and set the first row or the first column if it actually had a 0. So in order to do that, we're first going to deal with the 0th row. So we'll do for int I equals 0, I is less than, oh, whoops, sorry, my bad. If matrix of 0 of 0 is equal to 0, then we can just do arrays.fill matrix of 0 with 0. And the reason we can do this is because it's a row. So it's technically an array, right? A 2D array is basically just an array of arrays. So we can just fill that array with zeros. However, with the 0th column, it's a bit trickier. But we can still do it. We just set if first call, remember that's the variable that we set for that. If first call, then for int I equals 0, I is less than matrix dot length, I plus plus matrix I of 0 is equal to 0. So now if you run this, you can see here that we got this cross of zeros here. And I know that was a little bit complicated, so I'm going to re-go through my steps. So first we set a variable because this first 0, 0 is going to represent the first row and the first column, so that's not what we want, so that's why we create a variable for the first column. The next step is to set the flags, and the flags are basically setting the first row or the first column that needs to be set, the first element in the row or column that needs to be set to 0 equal to 0. And that'll be kind of like our indicator that it needs to be set to 0 later. And then once we iterate through that and set our flags, we can go through the matrix and set that row or column to 0. And then this was a deal with almost everything except for the first row or the first column because we didn't because those were our flags, right? And we didn't want to disturb them as we were iterating through. So now we need to deal with them separately now that the rest of the array is done. So if the first element, if the first row needs to be 0, we can just fill that. And if the first column needs to be, we can just fill that. So hopefully that made a little bit more sense. So now let's run it with a different example. So I'm just going to replace these. All right. And now if you run this, you can see here that we got that arc of zeros like we were supposed to. So I hope this video was helpful and see you in the next video.